It's the Modi government's first full-year budget, and before Arun Jaitley presents that, we've got our very special show, Agenda for the Finance Minister, and who better than Jagdish Bhagwati to talk about all of that. Thanks very much, Professor Bhagwati, for being with us. I want to first begin by talking to you, Professor Bhagwati, that the Finance Minister is going to present the Modi government's first full-year budget. Is the biggest drawback of this budget going to be the truckload of expectations he's against?
Yeah, but I think they have to emphasize that everything cannot come through the budget. I mean, this has traditionally been the case. But I think the policy where you introduce changes throughout the year and not necessarily concentrate in the budget is something we should get used to. Because there are a whole lot of changes which there's no reason why Mr. Jaitley should be leading them. Right. So financial part, of course, yes. But, you know, not opening up the system to foreign investment or improving trade access. Though, of course, actual trade tariffs are levied by the Finance Ministry.
Right, yes.
When we come to trade commitments and so on, those are done through Commerce Ministry, and this is where the World Trade Organization negotiations matter. So a lot of them sort of intermesh. But the notion that the Finance Ministry and the budget are the prince in Hamlet, I think needs to be reduced a bit. So I think we should not place too much burden on this being the make or break budget. Secondly, I expect some improvement. I mean, we have to scale down our expectations because bus deficits, etc., cannot just vanish overnight.
Right.
And Mr. Jaitley, if I was advising, I would say that, look, India is on the cusp of change, and India is very lucky right now, and he's going to try and take advantage of this fact. First, we've got a tremendous oil price decrease.
That's right.
That is something which we can split between taxation, which then gives us revenues for infrastructure and other spending, because this government also wants to spend money.
Yes.
But you can't spend money you don't have. So we have some relief from that angle. Maybe we can take 75%, right, and give a little less. But that's the political judgment. And secondly, remember, we're going to have to make commitments on things like energy.
In hindsight, do you believe the budget is right around the corner? Do you believe Mr. Jaitley was right in accepting the 4.1% fiscal deficit for this year? Because he's had to really go in for deep expenditure cuts to arrive at that figure. People are now beginning to say that why curtail the fiscal deficit to the last decimal point? You should allow yourself some fiscal slippage and let growth be given a chance. Do you think that's a valid argument? Because they say that rising tide will, lift all boats. So growth is perhaps going to be the only answer to this.
Yeah, but I think, you see, again, it depends on how you project these things. Because as growth has improved, just like in the United States, but I mean, no miracle has happened. Miracles don't happen in economics in that short. So Obama is better off, right? I mean, compared to what he was last year.
That's right.
Now, but still, it's nowhere near us wanting to open up a bottle of champagne. Same way, growth has improved, so a little more revenue should trickle in. So we have to make an estimate, which is all economists can do. And given that, and given the amount of revenue you're getting from oil and price decrease and so on, I think what they need to do is to forecast how much additional fiscal expenditure they can take. And if the system is growing, if the marginal resources which are available, then I would say, and then the inflation is reasonably under control. I mean, prices have not broken out in a big way. I think they could afford more deficit, and I think both Panagaria and Rajan, I think, are on agreement on this one, as far as I know.
The reason why I'm asking a question, Professor Bhagwati, is that so far, at least in UPA2 and in the last 2 to 3 years, there was this great obsession to not let ratings agencies downgrade you. That was the big lurking fear. And which is why perhaps Mr. Jaitley took on this daunting task. He chose to call it daunting in his first budget. He took on this daunting task. Do you believe he will be able to satisfy rating agencies if he were to breach that fiscal deficit? I don't want you to comment on the technicalities of fiscal deficit, but just the ratings agencies angle.
rating agencies, if they're sensible, which they are sometimes, don't go just by the fiscal deficit or what monetary policy is. They also look at the overall economic policy. Now, if I was on a rating agency like Standard & Poor, whose forecasts are both Standard and Poor.
Right. Yes.
In any case, the point is you do have a situation where they do an over-analysis. Now, if anyone looking at what's been happening since Modi government took over, they're almost certain to realize that the system is opening up. Now, therefore, that's a huge plus factor in the overall evaluation. If you're not opening up and if the fiscal deficit was getting out of hand, God help you in terms of your rating.
Right.
But these are two countervailing tendencies.
So
I
what
think
you're saying is that this fiscal slippage will be very different from what the Pranab Mukherjee fiscal slippage was. Because he let the fiscal slip and look at where we landed.
No, that's exactly, you should be an economist.
No.
No, because that's exactly the point I'm making. That the context in which specific deficits and surpluses at the fiscal level or monetary policy are judged is very different. And I think that's where Prime Minister is at a great advantage. And so whatever Mr. Jaitley does, he's sort of cushioned in a way. So
That's right.
I think but whatever he does, he's got to present the case in this way. I don't think they're doing that, but I think Panagaria will do that because he has a wider context in mind. So I think the team is good, and I think Raghu Rajan also will be a first-rate chap to look at the monetary and fiscal situation.
Because the budget is right around the corner, we want to touch upon this point that while the private sector is a big believer in Narendra Modi, corporate India rallied behind him, they're a believer in Arun Jaitley as well. Why is it that we haven't really had investment break ground? What is it that corporate India is still wary of?
I think the part of the problem is the state of the world economy also. They buy into something like the argument which Raghu Rajan has been making, that the world economy is depressed by and large, therefore we have to look at the domestic market and not at the international market. I think he's mistaken in the sense that you can certainly break into the international market. That's what the Far Eastern economists did when we were pessimistic about exports. So we never competed and it became self-fulfilling.
That's right.
And these guys were optimistic. If they saw a barrier, they went around it. But you don't sit around saying, I can't do it because our tariff barriers or other people are competing. And I think today, what is happening is that they're not going to listen to Raghu or to you and me. They're going to go and compete, and they're going to go into those international markets.
Exactly.
And so that is something which is a strength, again, of the sort of Gujarat DNA in the following sense, that when you leave it to the private sector, they're used to doing exactly these kind. Whereas government people and economists just sort of give up. I was in the Planning Commission trying to see what we could export. I'm not a businessman. I couldn't think of a thing.
And look how much they're exporting out of India now.
So I was an export pessimist because you started to say, can we export this? Can we export?
In the government, yes.
But once the possibility of export was possible, had been brought in, then the businessmen found ways of doing all sorts of things.
And they're exporting just about everything from India now.
Yes, and I think there's no reason why we can't do what the Chinese did. Once we leave it to the private sector, I'm not a libertarian. I do believe in government playing a role.
Right.
But we have really undermined the private sector in a big way.
What is it that the government can do? Yes, there are right noises being made.
Right.
I think the first thing that Mr. Modi has done, and rightly so, is that he's trying to get the states on board as far as this whole Make in India initiative is concerned. But what else can the government do via this budget or outside to get some of the potential game-changing things, a Make in India, a digital India really take off?
Yeah, but you see, Make in India can be, since you raised the question, can be interpreted in two ways. One is investors abroad. We are open now for business. And that's a good thing, because that is the good part, because it will also build into our exports.
That's right.
The Chinese, basically the whole Guangdong provinces, which are 4 on the east coast.
True.
About 650 million workers are employed there, I mean population. That became the export platform. And if you look at everything, it's not that they had any brand names or anything.
Exactly.
It was all foreign firms coming in. So they really exploited foreign investment in a very gigantic and beautiful way. We've really bypassed that altogether. Russians have, there's nothing being made there in an efficient way. We have a few things, but it's still very limited.
Very low cost, very low end.
And very limited. So if we let foreign investors enter in a big way, and make things in India, because these are foreign things, and they can exploit our skilled labor, our knowledge of English, and also a decent amount of literacy by now, like with Pratham and other NGOs also helping. Literacy is turned around in a big way. We can use all of that, you see, to export, because these firms are also have their own purchasing departments, they've got distribution outlets and so on. So that part is good. But when he says make in India and he says everything should be made in India, then he's getting back into the import substitution framework. And this is true of Americans also. President Obama says the same thing, we must do more manufacturers.
He talks about Buffalo and Bangalore all the time.
I know. So I think there is that in the air, and I think Panagore and I and other people have written saying, what we want is labor-intensive manufacturers, not just manufacturers.
That's right.
Right? And even services can be labor-intensive. The big thing we have to learn from the Far East is that they really use labor-intensive growth.
That's right.
And not necessarily in manufacturers. At that time it was in manufacturing. But today you've got all kinds of things you can do in the services sector. Like,
fair point.
And so that is what they should. So rather than say, the Prime Minister and his advisors still imply that his manufacturers is important. And I think we should emphasize not manufacturing, but labor intensive. And once that happens, that's also good for employment.
And you're actually veered to the very potential argument that a lot of people are beginning to make. Why just push manufacturing? Why not push everything that's job generating?
Exactly.
Which may include
that's what not may, it will.
That's right.
It will include services.
Yes.
Of course, it won't include haircuts and so on, which I need.
Right.
But
you look dapper without it.
But there are lots of tradable services, you see.
That's right.
And so I think I think there is a tendency in India also today to say manufacturers matters, or manufacturers is the only thing that matters. And this is an older fallacy that goes back actually to Adam Smith. And so one of the funny ways in which an editor of The Economist put it is that many people believe that nothing is worth manufacturing unless you can drop it on your foot. You can't drop a service on your foot.
At least not in this budget. But many people thought when Mr. Modi did ride to power, and he did not come in a fractured mandate, he came with 282 MPs to boast of. Many people thought that Mr. Jaitley squandered the opportunity as far as correcting the retrospective taxation is concerned. Do you believe he could perhaps undo that, even though he's promised the global investor community, I am never going to charge you, or I'm never going to tax you retrospectively? Is that a ghost that needs to be laid to rest? It's somewhere still alive in the back of people's minds.
Yeah, I think some people worry about it, but I think now you have the two things you have to do. One, of course, is for the Prime Minister himself to supply the assurance, okay, and say this will never do that. He has that force of personality and so on, okay, and he's supposed to be not anti-investment, foreign investment, and secondly, I think he's got to assure people that we're going to have judicial reform. You see, you take Enron, and they were, it was a mistake what we did in terms of giving them a contract to without actually tenders and so on. So a lot of the fault was on us. But when they went to the courts, the courts found for them. But it takes a long time. And so while we are a nation of laws, we are also a procrastinating nation to extensive delay. So we have to then really get into, say, look, we'll have rapid disposal of cases. Now, one way to do it, of course, is to outsource it and, have international arbitration tribunals and so on. If we don't want that, we've got to have domestic tribunals which are going to move rapidly, because nobody believes that we will confiscate things and so on, except for this retrospective action.
That's right.
Which I think we can lay to rest. But Enron won all the cases eventually.
Exactly.
This will never happen in a country like China. So we are a nation of laws, but the laws are like,
It's
very slow moving, very slow.
At a very
so I
slow
think
pace.
that is the biggest thing we can do.
I have two quick last questions, and question number one is that Mr. Jaitley and Mr. Modi have both said that subsidies have to be targeted better for them to really reach the actual benefactor of the subsidy, and which is why I'm asking you this question. Do you expect Mr. Jaitley to bite the bullet as far as subsidies are concerned? The UPA could not walk down that part. They kept talking about the direct benefit transfer and all of those things. But do you expect Mr. Jaitley to bite the bullet and not just streamline but also rationalize the subsidy burden?
Yeah, but the way to do it basically would be through the Aadhaar movement, where you get direct cash transfers, right? And that is something Panagari and everybody believes in. The only problem with that is that means the politicians don't get their usual cut, right? Because most of these are digging up holes and filling them up, but underneath the mud is a sort of the little safe which is carrying the cash for the politician. So that is. So Mr. Modi has announced actually that he'll go back to Aadhaar. At the same time, the guy from the minister from Haryana he appointed, he said they're going to continue with the old Enriga scheme.
That's right.
Because he's the guy who wants money for the politicians. So that is where the politics will run into the economics. Because the economics clearly says that it's a wasteful way to give assistance to the poor. Through the Enriga scheme, because a lot of it creates useless assets and so on.
And some economists have even called it very inflationary in nature.
Yeah, yes and no, one could argue that. But the fact that the Prime Minister said he was wanted to shift to Aadhaar and then reduce reliance on Enriga was reversed by this fellow. I don't know whether it's been re-reversed, but the reason for reversal is the politicians make money. And so the economic argument was it should be removed and Aadhaar should be the way to distribute it so as to eliminate politics. But you can't eliminate politics. The politicians are the ones who are going to vote on this. And I think this is where, certainly, I mean, this is really the Prime Minister's preserve, not Mr. Jaitley's, you see. I think this is where, I mean, he's got to be working at it. But the point is there's so many things on his plate. So Enriga scheme is certainly something he should want to basically scrap. So he said he's going to reduce it to 100 key villages or really needy villages. So there was a big uproar on the part of some economists, but politicians as well who were getting them the money.
And it's always a political hot potato.
And it was probably a mistake on the Prime Minister's part to give it to someone from Haryana, which is not exactly known for
the best economic minds
for pursuing the public good as against private profit.
We know all about that, don't we? But
so I think that shows how difficult some of these things are. But you need a determined Prime Minister with a clear vision and common sense
behind this.
To keep at it, because some things are going to take longer.
And this is one of my last questions. What a lot of people have welcomed is the fact that this government is serious about opening up sectors to foreign direct investment.
Right.
So when it came into office, it decided to open up insurance and then defense and later infrastructure, real estate, all of that. While these sectors have been opened up in this budget around this corner, which are the other sectors that you expect to be opened up? And I also add on to the question, you're hopeful about retail still.
Yeah, I personally think that to say only this sector or only that sector is exactly the counterpart of industrial policy, that we will choose which sector to promote and which sector not to promote. That is the one lesson we have learned in post-war planning. It's just that industrial policy of that sort doesn't make sense at all. Now, in Japan, they did that. But if you look at the Japanese model, it's not the government which is really driving industrial policy. It's the Mitsui, Mitsubishi, the private big firms which are driving the governmental intervention. So it's the other way around. So they're saying, look, leave us alone. Because governments need not leave you alone. So it is basically a private sector model, Japan. Although it appears to a naked eye, superficial eye, that it's really meaty, yes. Meaning the Minister of International Trade is running this. So I think what we have to do is, basically, I don't know of any country which is really prospered by heavy government-directed investment. So I would say, let people decide. We've got a number of entrepreneurs now who can do it. In the same way, don't say only investment in this sector, not in that sector, because all sectors, in my view. I would say very clearly to, maybe I should write another article for the Economic Times or something, pointing out that industrial policy is not the answer. Leave it to the private sector. And you might prescribe them from going to certain maybe sensitive sectors like defense, but there also we are opening up.
Exactly.
And so
the argument of sensitive sectors doesn't actually hold.
No, it really
anymore.
Should not be,
yes.
Because do you expect any? But I used to say when they said Japanese miracle was due to bureaucrats deciding on what to invest in, I said if bureaucrats had decided.
It would have never been a miracle.
That itself would, that choice, that itself would have been a miracle.
I have a last question to ask you, Professor Bhagwati, before I let you go. And you're not going to tell me you'll catch the next flight home. If you were the finance minister, what are the 3 things that you wouldn't do in the budget and the one transformative idea that you would?
Gosh,
you cannot take that flight back to the US.
I would take the job of being the finance minister.
But if you were.
This is where I agree with Professor Seth. He was also asked, what would you do if you were the finance minister? He said he would run away.
I'm not letting you run away. Like I'm not letting you.
We Indians are not really macroeconomists. Oh. But I think what I would do would be to essentially emphasize the fact that I wouldn't say what 3 things you would do. The first thing I would do would be to say, look, there are certain things that the budget can do and the finance, but there are large numbers of things which the country needs to do, which can be done outside of the budget. And I think we've got to learn how to do this, like in many countries in the world, the budget is not the instrument through which major changes are made anyway. Right. So I think that's the first thing we need to learn. Don't just think of the budget. It should not be that important day, right?
There are the 364 days to make policies and implement
there are so many other important things to do. And 2, I would make sure that there was a complete analysis, because we've really not had that sort of, I mean, I know that because that part I've followed to see the reports and so on, that really we need very careful analysis of things like what's the effect of the oil price decrease.
That's right.
How much would it be so sort of forward planning into which, like for the next 10 years, into which we can fit the first steps in the current budget.
That's right.
And that has to be done. I've never seen that done in any of the annual reports and so on, because we've never had,
that kind of thinking, that kind of planning really
exactly.
Yes.
So I think that is what it's more about the way in which we transact business around the budget rather than what we put into the budget, because what we put into the budget will depend very much on the way the economy, the cookie crumbles, as it were.
That's right.
The way the economy, because like tomorrow, if the price for oil starts rising, I have to change what I'm going to do in the budget.
True.
So I think that is that's important. I think that's the main thing I would say if I was being the finance minister, and I would hire a first-rate economist to really help me.
Where will you find another Jagdish Bhagwati to be hired?
I'm not.
But on that note, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.